my family. Welcome back to another episode. I don't know about where you're from, but I know around here, a lot of ghost stories start with, so this place is Indian burial ground, or so this place is haunted by a Native American. There's actually even a whole story about how the town I grew up in is haunted by a ghost of a Native American who is sometimes seen walking around. I've never seen it. I do know that the town I grew up in was at one point home to a fairly large size burial mound built by the Adena, but I can't personally vouch for Native American spirits haunting my town. So in this episode you'll get some stories about Native American spirits and some other things that I just think that you might find interesting. Sit back and enjoy the show. And if you like it, don't forget to give me a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. I never said I don't believe ghosts exist. I always wanted to believe in them. I just never seen one. This all changed when my older brother started having some sightings at his house in a western suburb of Chicago. It all started about 10 years ago. One night, my brother was letting his dog out into the backyard just before he turned in. In the middle of the lawn, he noticed a grayish mass. As he looked more closely, the form began to take the shape of what looked like a person kneeling in prayer. The dog was oblivious to the shape, so my brother just shrugged it off as his eyes playing tricks on him. Ever since that night, my brother has had numerous experiences. About 1 week later, my brother was exiting his front door. As he walked to his car, he once again saw this shape, this time kneeling on his front lawn. To my brother's horror, the shape this time stood up and started walking towards him, as if to greet him. He turned and ran back into his house. Once inside, he became sick to his stomach. He didn't understand. Was someone playing tricks on him? 6 months passed. My brother was watching TV one night when his wife called him to bed. He turned off the TV and started to head to the top of the stairs, where his wife was waiting for him. He got halfway up the stairs. A small ball of light materialized between them. The ball stayed in the same place for several seconds, and then suddenly zipped behind his back and disappeared. My brother and sister-in-law knew now that they were not alone in this house. My brother called me the next day to tell me what had happened. I thought maybe he had been drinking or something. I asked him if this thing had tried to harm him in any way, and he said no. I told him just relax and eventually things will go away. Boy, was I wrong. Whatever was in and around his house apparently locked it there and had no intention of leaving. A few days later, my brother heard something rattling around in the bushes in front of his house. He opened the blinds and stared out the window. There in the darkness, staring back at him, was a face. My brother froze. The face was that of an Indian, old and wrinkled. Finally realizing what he was looking at, he closed the blinds and just sat back down on the sofa. About a minute later, a sweet, heavy scent permeated the entire room. Then the ball of light he had seen before materialized in his living room. He was scared, but not as scared as he had been before. He thought back to what I had said. This apparently was not a hostile spirit. It seemed very interested in my brother. The land and property once belonged to Alexander Robinson, chief of the Potawatomi, Chippewa, and Ottawa Indians. He was given a large plot of land for his aid during the Fort Dearborn massacre. He was buried along with his family no more than half a mile from my brother's house. His final resting place, in a forest preserve, has always been a hotspot for supernatural activity. My brother was convinced that the man he saw was in fact an Indian, maybe even Alexander Robinson himself. Over the next few years, my brother and the spirit lived together in peace in this house. Every once in a while, the spirit would make itself known. A ball of light appearing here and there, a sweet, pungent smell. It almost always as if the spirit had become a new member of our family. Occasionally, he would call me and tell me stories. I'd play along with him, never really believing his stories. All that changed one night when I was visiting. We were hanging out at my brother's house watching a baseball game, and I was sitting on the couch, and I just so happened to look up at the stairs. Up there in the darkness, I saw it. All I saw was a head. It had no real facial features, and I only saw 2 eyes looking down at me. I jumped out of my seat. I knew I wasn't seeing things. My brother chuckled and said, "Relax, he won't hurt you." Just as he said that, it disappeared. I had seen my very first ghost. I have been a believer in the paranormal ever since. Probably the most graphic incident that happened at my brother's happened just over a year ago. The spirit spoke to him. It was late at night, and my brother was lying in bed. He was just about to doze off when all of a sudden he heard a deep voice say, "Wake up! They're trying to get in!" My brother jumped out of bed. As he did, he noticed a bright light outside his window. He looked out and saw a police car driving slowly up the street, shining the light at all the homes across the street. My brother would later learn that a house across the street had been broken into that night. The spirit was warning my brother. He was convinced that somebody was trying to get in that night. My brother still lives in this house with his Indian friend. He says that he'll never sell the house. He doesn't want to leave his friend behind. My parents lived in this house for about 5 years, way back in the 1970s, and always felt a bit uneasy living there. My parents bought the house with plans to start off their new family just before my sister was born. It was small but welcoming to a young couple just about to start a family. My mother was the first to get an uneasy feeling when she was resting with my sister on the sofa in the living room. Our dog Taffy was in the hallway growling with her teeth showing and all the hair on her back standing on end. My mother could not figure out what Taffy was growling at and tried to call her near. Taffy would not take her eyes off whatever was in the hallway. My mother got up and walked towards Taffy, but as soon as she came near the puppy, the episode was over and Taffy went back to her favorite spot in the house as if nothing had happened. Another time, my mother had a friend from out of town over to stay the night. As soon as she walked into the house, she noticed something strange right away. She told my mother there was a presence in the house, and that it would be wise to have my sister baptized and to have the house blessed by a priest. My mother didn't take the advice and continued about her everyday life in the house. The next incident happened just after my parents had came home, with the main doors open, finding nothing out of place. They knew they had locked the house up before leaving, and thought that somebody must have broke in, but they found no one in the house and nothing was missing. They asked their neighbors if they had seen anything, but no one from the neighborhood knew what they were talking about. This happened several times. One evening, my mother was laying in bed, while my father was working the graveyard shift. She started feeling very uneasy while he was working late at night, and she refused to sleep just in case someone or something would harm her or my sister. While sitting up in bed, she saw a figure of a man in a raccoon hat and buckskin, kind of like what Davy Crockett would be wearing, walking down the hallway. This man never looked at her or even acknowledged my mother's presence. He just walked right into the wall and disappeared into thin air. At this point, she thought she was going crazy. When my father came home, she told him about the strange man in the house and what he had looked like. My father didn't say anything about it. He just calmed her thoughts and told her to get some rest. Not long after, my parents found a new house and moved. Whoever the native was stayed behind and never bothered us again. Years later, while having a good time with old friends, the ghost of the native man came up into conversation. My mother was talking about the old house and the story of the ghost when my father jumped in and mentioned that he had in fact seen the ghost too. My mother was astounded and could not believe that my father had not confided in her and had kept this a secret for so many years. My father said that he had seen someone walking through the house and had his own experience with Taffy. My father believed the ghost was that of a Native American that had lived in the area at one time. He felt that the spirit would never hurt anybody in the house, and that he felt the family was safe and that the spirit was friendly, maybe just looking for something or someone. He was peaceful and respectful, despite leaving the door open on occasion. While I was in high school, I became friends with the granddaughter of the current owners of the house. She told me that the house that her grandparents lived in and how strange things happened to her family there. At first, we had no idea that we were talking about the same house until I drove past it and pointed out the house to my friends in the car. Kim spoke up and said, that's the house my grandparents live in. We both looked at each other and realized our stories had a lot in common. We talked about it and found out that the ghost was the same Native American my parents had seen. Whoever the ghost may be, I hope he finds what he's looking for and can finally be at rest. I was raised by my grandparents. Their house has its share of odd occurrences. knocking sounds from within the walls, an apparition of my great-grandmother, and eerie feelings along the long hallway to the bedrooms. One night, I was around 9. I was laying in bed trying to fall asleep. My bed was facing the doorway. I could see into my grandparents' bedroom across the hallway. The only light visible came from a small nightlight at the center of the hall. As I was tossing and turning, trying to fall asleep, I looked out into the hallway and saw a young woman with curly hair, her body glowing faintly. She carried a candle in her cupped hands. She walked slowly and paused for a second, turned to walk into my grandparents' room. Being the nervous child I was, I quickly pulled the covers over my head and tried to ignore it. Eventually, I fell asleep. Years passed, and I never saw another apparition. When I was 16, I was still living there. I grew up in that house, but had moved across the hall, having switched rooms with my grandparents. I decided I would try an experiment. I found a dress similar to the one I saw the apparition wearing, so I decided to put it on and sort of relive that experience. I had very curly hair, and it was about the same length as the apparition's. I put on the dress, grabbed a short white candle, turned off the hall light, lit the candle, and took the path I'd witnessed the apparition take. I took the same route, made the same slow walk, paused at my old bedroom door, looked in, walked into what was now my bedroom. Was what I saw a ghost, or merely a glimpse into my future? Was I seeing myself on some intersecting point of time? I'm still trying to figure that one out. My next story occurred a year later. I was attending a Native American ceremony in the woods of Nebraska. We had been out in the woods for a week, living in our tents and teepees, ceremonies going throughout this time. I heard stories of the spirits that lived in the trees, and, being as curious I am about the supernatural, I was nervous and excited about what I might see out there. For the first few days, things were normal. I went about my business, working in the cook shack, making large quantities of food for the huge number of people there. One evening, after dinner, I was sitting at a table with an elder. We were talking about the name he had just given me, when my right hand suddenly went ice cold. My mother was sitting to the left of me, and I said, "Wow, my hand just went freezing cold." There was no wind, and it was July in Nebraska, pretty hot even after the sun went down. She said, "Oh, don't worry, that's just a spirit touching you." I can't recall the name for them, so I'll just say spirit, but I think it's Wanagi. But I'm not really 100% sure. Okay, no big deal. Our tent was set up along the perimeter of the tree line. An outhouse was about 50 feet to the right. On several occasions, while walking to the outhouse, I noticed black human forms in the trees. When I shined my flashlight on them, they were gone. I attributed this to my imagination. A few days later, a friend who I'd brought along on the trip was sitting in my tent with me, talking about the day. I was on the left side, leaning back on my arms, with my lantern flashlight to my left, about 12 inches away. It's the type of lantern flashlight where you can pull on the body of it and reveal the lantern, or push it together and it'd be a flashlight. We were talking, and I noticed the light shifting in the tent. There were no other lights aside from the bonfire on the other side of camp, about 300 feet away. I looked at my flashlight. It was standing on its edge. All we could do was sit there and watch it. It stood on its edge for about 2 minutes. We decided to leave the tent for a while, because we were both a bit freaked out. The flashlight had a rounded head, not a square one. My hand did cause the floor of the tent to dent slightly, but my flashlight was nowhere near my hand or the dent my hand had made in the floor. The light was literally standing on one rounded edge. When I mentioned it to my mom the next day, she quipped, "Oh, they're playing with you. They must like you." I really wasn't scared, just a bit nervous, considering we were out in the wilderness with no lights. I was intrigued more than anything, considering the nature of the ceremony we were attending. I'm certain the spirits were roused by our activity.